This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Let's talk for a moment about the recent announcement by the College Board, which puts out the SAT college admissions test, that they'll be assigning an adversity score to each person who takes the test and then giving the score to colleges who request it, but not providing it to the student test taker. The score is to be between 0 and 100. With 50 purportedly representing the average level of adversity faced by a student and 100 representing the maximum level. The score is set up so that it can be added to the SAT score. Incidentally, the official name for the adversity score is the Environmental Context Dashboard. The score is in fact an algorithm. The calculation is based on an evaluation of things like the level of adversity in the neighborhood in which the student resides, the school which he attends, and the family of which he is a member. For example, a high crime rate in the neighborhood would elevate the level of adversity, as would an elevated number of free or subsidized school lunches, as would living with a single parent. Keep in mind that receipt of the adversity score does not prevent schools from taking race into account in evaluation of applications. So the adversity score prevents the very real likelihood of a sort of double counting. Colleges often say they want to promote diversity so they can offer positions to minority students even when their test scores are lower than other qualified non-minority students. Given income distribution in the U.S., disproportionate percentages of minorities reside in neighborhoods with higher crime rates. As a result, the adversity score of a minority student is likely to be higher than that of a non-minority student. Moreover, given that the rate of single motherhood is astronomically high in the black community, the adversity score of a black student is likely to be much higher than that of a non-minority student. As a result, unless the more subjective, non-algorithmic factoring in of race in the admissions process is completely abandoned in favor of the adversity score, the effect of the adversity score will be to significantly increase the extent to which minorities are treated more advantageously than non-minorities, other than Asians, in the college admissions process. And that process is already the subject of multiple lawsuits contending that it amounts to illegal discrimination against Asians and whites. Moreover, there's reason for concern about the fact that it's an algorithm to begin with. Think about all the instances where the algorithms used by social media companies have resulted in persons or personalities being suspended from social media platforms, only to have the social media company later come out and reinstate the person and apologize, stating that the suspension was inadvertent or a mistake. Now think about the fact that the futures of young students are at stake based on their SAT scores, and the College Board does not plan to release the adversity scores to the students. No doubt it's been frustrating for YouTube or Twitter personalities who've been suspended from the platform without knowing exactly how that suspension occurred, because they don't know the contents of the algorithm, but at least they know they've been suspended. That gives them the notice that there's something that they can fight. It's what starts the process where they can decide whether to appeal. A student who takes the SAT, on the other hand, who then has his score effectively downgraded because he received less than 50 points on the adversity score, has no idea it happened. Meanwhile, another student receives all 100 points on the adversity score and also has no idea it happened. And the first student is completely unaware that the second student has been placed at a competitive advantage to him. He has no knowledge that occurred. He has no knowledge how it occurred. He has no knowledge whether a coding error may have been made, and he's been given no opportunity to appeal. As poorly as this has been designed, we should talk for a moment about its effect. The wealthy are still going to be able to get around this because they're still going to be able to commit to making huge donations to the school, or they're still going to be able to get additional considerations as a result of being a legacy. The persons this is going to hurt the most are the children of middle-class and upper-middle-class parents whose parents have worked to get their kids into neighborhoods with low crime rates and schools with better reputations. This proposal matches perfectly with the core economic constituency of the Democrat Party as it's currently configured. It benefits the very wealthy and the poor. Those in between are the ones that get shafted. My most sincere hope is that this bad idea is extinguished fast by market pressures. I hope that in huge numbers and with loud protests, parents abandon the SAT and move en masse to the ACT. I know that articles have mentioned that the ACT has plans to implement the same sort of score for its test. If there's enough blowback, maybe they'll put those plans in the trash where they belong. Next topic. Chernobyl. Let's talk for a moment about a television miniseries which is having quite an impact on me. The series is Chernobyl. It's on HBO. I've watched the 4 episodes released so far, and rest assured I'll be watching the concluding episode the moment it comes out. Those of you who've listened to multiple episodes of this podcast have no doubt heard me say that I'm a fan of film. One of the things I truly enjoy is going to the movies. It's not just watching the film itself. I enjoy the experience of getting away from everything else, ordering my popcorn and usually some additional food because I attend one of those theaters that has good food, at least food at the level of a bar and grill. In that respect, I'm resistant to the trend these days of binge-watching television series on cable or Netflix or Amazon Prime. I recognize there is some tremendous quality programming being put out in television dramas these days, but among other things, I always question whether you can enjoy them as much as you can enjoy films at the movie theater. At the movie theater, you're forced to abandon distractions. You can't be distracted by your cell phone, you have to put it on silent. If there's a slow spot in the film, you can't pick up your iPad and check the latest news story or Twitter or Facebook. You can't answer the phone or make a call. You've committed to the movie. And that allows filmmakers producing films for the movie theater to engage in character development that doesn't involve action at a breakneck pace, because they know that unlike films being viewed at home, they have extra time before the viewer turns away and commits to electronic devices, because the viewers in the movie theater disconnected from those electronic devices. That's the theory, at least. And it should result in a better product viewed at the movie theater than what's produced for viewing on cable TV or streaming services. But it's just a theory. I think there's a valid point to it, but Chernobyl goes a long way towards disproving it. Moreover, because it's produced for the television and doesn't come with an outrageous ticket price, it lends itself to a presentation that feels like it's somewhere between a cinema film drama and a documentary. Unlike attending a mindless action flick at the local Cineplex, after watching an episode of Chernobyl, I feel like I've improved myself, like I've learned something at the same time that I've been completely engrossed in the film-watching experience. For years, I've been incredibly disappointed in Hollywood. The prevalence of elitist, leftist attitudes among Hollywood stars is off-putting, to say the least. And the fact that those attitudes dominate the themes of the films leaves conservative moviegoers like myself frustrated as we search for films we'll enjoy. Because of that extreme leftist perspective from Hollywood, the historical drama I most wish Hollywood would produce has never been touched. That subject is the scourge of communism. The Western world is filled with the inspiring stories of people who've escaped the scourge of communism. There are high-ranking military officers whose parents managed to get out from behind the Iron Curtain. There are businessmen and women in America and Western Europe who can testify about their suffering, or the suffering and bravery of their parents and grandparents behind the Iron Curtain, and the pride of their families in the freedom and opportunity enjoyed in America and Western Europe. Every one of those stories is a potential film. Imagine a sweeping Hollywood epic that connects those stories and depicts the desperation of those trapped in the Soviet Union or its satellite states. For years, I've longed for such a film to be released, but I've always been skeptical it would ever happen. Why? Because much of Hollywood is so committed to the ideology of the left that I suspect they could never accurately depict the bankrupt, immoral, and corrupt ideology of communism. So why am I bringing this up? Am I trying to say that Chernobyl is that film? Well, clearly not. There is nothing about Chernobyl that depicts escaping communism. But there is an element of the miniseries which caught me by surprise. It actually depicts at least some of the fundamentally corrupt and immoral nature of communism. It confronts communist bureaucrats lying and covering up the immediate deadly threat to the population and celebrating the fact that they're doing so for the good of the communist state. Throughout the series, you'll encounter statements like, quote, "There is no truth. Ask the bosses whatever you want and you'll get the lie," close quote, or, quote, "You didn't see graphite because it's not there," close quote. References to exclusion zones to protect against radiation being drawn at 30 miles instead of 200 miles and correctly being labeled as, quote, "an arbitrary decision by a party apparatchik," close quote. My personal favorite? A joke delivered by the no-nonsense team leader of a group of Soviet coal miners. What's as big as a house, burns 20 liters of fuel every hour, puts out a load of smoke and noise, and cuts an apple into 3 pieces. A Soviet machine made to cut apples into 4 pieces. Chernobyl is sobering filmmaking. It's terrifying at points. So much like a horror film that it's hard to believe it's actually true. It's shocking, almost depressing, but you can't turn away. It isn't the sweeping film depicting the horrors of communism that I wanted to see made, but in covering the historic disaster, it does confront at least some of those horrors. And for that, I applaud it. It's well worth the watch. Next topic. Pretending mediocrity is excellence. It's time for the latest chapter in the upside-down Alice in Wonderland world that competitive sports have become in the age of the transgender athlete. I've talked in the past about transgender girls who are biological boys being allowed to compete against biological girls in high school competitions in Connecticut. I've talked about a transgender woman who is a biological man being allowed to compete against biological women in a cycling competition. And I've talked about the Equality Act, which would have codified that insanity into law nationwide if passed and signed, having received the votes of every single Democrat member of Congress. Now let's talk about a transgender athlete at the college level. This time it's another track and field event. Cece Telfer, formerly known as Craig Telfer, absolutely dominated the NCAA Division II women's 400-meter hurdles. She won by more than 1.5 seconds. That's a very large margin at the championship level. For frame of reference, let's look at the times for all of the competitors in the finals. The field was supposed to be 8, but only 7 actually raced. The 7th place finisher had a time of 1 minute 1.348 seconds. In 6th place, 1 minute 1.344 seconds. In 5th, 1 minute 1.24. In 4th, 1 minute 0.29 seconds. In 3rd place, 59.49 seconds. In 2nd, 59.21 seconds. In 1st, Cece Telfer, the transgender female who is a biological male, 57.53 seconds. What do those numbers show you? The entire spread between 7th place and 2nd place, that's between 7th place and 2nd place, is only slightly larger than the spread between 2nd place and 1st place. Cece Telfer, the transgender female who is a biological male, who came in 1st place winning the championship, must be one heck of an athlete. She dominated. She blew away the competition. Surely, as such a tremendous athlete, she must have been dominating like this her whole collegiate career. Was she? Well, in the case of CC Telfer, we can check, because she competed as Craig Telfer previously. TribLive.com on May 29, 2019 covered her win. In an article by Chris Patrick entitled, quote, "Transgender Woman Who Last Year Competed as a Man Wins NCAA Track Championship," close quote. The article notes that, quote, as recently as January 2018, Telfer had been competing as an athlete for Franklin Pierce's men's team as Craig. Telfer finished 8th in a field of 9 in the men's 400-meter at the Middlebury Winter Classic in Vermont, close quote. The NCAA allows transgender women who were biological men to compete against biological women so long as they've been suppressing their testosterone for a year before competing. We're told by the NCAA Transgender Handbook that, quote, according to medical experts on the issue, the assumption that a transgender woman competing on a women's team would have a competitive advantage outside the range of performance and competitive advantage or disadvantage that already exists among female athletes is not supported by evidence. Close quote. Okay, that statement really doesn't fit the evidence, does it? Dominant transgender female athlete CC Telfer, who slaughtered the competition in the women's championships, is the same person who just a year earlier finished 8th out of a field of 9 when competing in the men's event. Bear with me for a moment. Earlier in this podcast, I talked about why I was so blown away by the miniseries Chernobyl. I was blown away because, notwithstanding the tendency of the Hollywood left to refuse to acknowledge the failures of communism because it conflicts with the left-wing utopian view of that corrupt ideology, those involved with the Chernobyl miniseries presented the truth about that corrupt ideology. And in so doing, they presented depictions of Soviet party or apparatchiks blithely issuing false declarations that risked the lives of thousands and maybe millions to preserve the secrecy that the Soviet state so desperately needed to maintain the illusion of competence. And bureaucrats cowering in fear of the truth, stating, quote, you didn't see graphite because it's not there, close quote, refusing to acknowledge the presence of graphite from the exploded reactor core lying on the ground outside of the building, because that would have amounted to an acknowledgement that the reactor core had exploded, that a reactor produced by the great Soviet state had failed catastrophically. Now look at the situation with transgender athletes. I've laid out in multiple episodes the proof of the physical advantage of males over females in athletic contests involving strength, speed, or size. To deny that reality is the modern, sporting equivalent of, you didn't see graphite because it's not there. But the statement from the NCAA Transgender Handbook isn't quite the same. We're a bit more crafty here in America. Perhaps it's just that the meritocracy created by capitalism produces success among those who are more careful wordsmiths. Let's go back and look at the NCAA statement again. Quote, according to medical experts on this issue, the assumption that a transgender woman competing on a women's team would have a competitive advantage outside the range of performance and competitive advantage or disadvantage that already exists among female athletes is not supported by the evidence. At first blush, that seems to be saying that transgender females don't have an advantage over biological females by virtue of being biological males. And that's the kind of statement that would be needed to justify allowing transgender females who are biological males to compete against biological females. But on a careful reading, it doesn't say that. What it appears to be saying is that you can't assume there's an advantage that falls outside the range of advantages and disadvantages among female athletes. In other words, the range from the worst female athlete to the best. If that's what it means, it's simply saying that you can't assume that because a transgender female is a biological male, they'll be so advantaged that they'll perform above the levels of the best female athletes. Really? That's the standard? Until a transgender female track star performs above the level of Florence Griffith Joyner, she doesn't have an advantage by virtue of being a biological male? That throws the entire point of athletics being divided between male and female competitors in the trash can. It destroys female athletics. Sports are supposed to promote, identify, and measure excellence. What is happening by allowing transgender females who are biological males to compete against biological females is that sport is being used to pretend that mediocrity is excellence. Transgender females who've benefited from the biology of the male body are winning championships when they didn't even come close when competing as males. Mediocrity is being celebrated as excellence. Female sports are faced with destruction, and much of the public is sitting in silence for fear of being labeled transphobic by the left-wing mob, and their careers and social status being placed in jeopardy. Meanwhile, the regulators who should be rejecting this outright are basically saying, "You didn't see graphite because it's not there." This has to stop. It's an attack on women's sports. It will take away championship opportunities from women. It will take away scholarship opportunities from women. It's an attack on women. It's an attack on reality. There is no way any woman, especially one who is or was a competitive athlete, or who is or aspires to be the mother of a girl who is a competitive athlete, should ever vote for a politician who supports the madness of allowing transgender women who are biological men to compete against biological women in women's sports. And remember, every single Democrat member of Congress voted in support of this madness. Hopefully you don't think my podcast is madness. Hopefully you think it's the most sensible one out there. And I'll be back with more sensible thoughts next week. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.